Want to welcome everybody to Psyfeld. This morning's discussion will be on the abstinence. So who wants to start us off? Any particular character or theme? It's open to everyone. Where would the group like to start today? How about we just pick a character?
We could start with George.
It's always that's always a very solid,
A safe place to start.
very safe. So what is going on with George Costanza in this episode, The Abstinence?
So basically his girlfriend has mono and her doctor said that she needs to abstain from sex. And so he has to abstain from sex at that point, but he uses it as an opportunity to become so smart. He picks up all these hobbies. He learns Portuguese. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And then as soon as they stop abstaining, he reverts back to a simpler form.
Simpler, yep. All right, so any parallel to psychiatry or perhaps even a metaphor here? Is there a condition, is there an experience where an individual might be focused on one thing?
Oh yeah, he's kind of manic. Almost.
That's certainly number one, right? I mean, he could actually, in this particular episode, be demonstrating signs and symptoms of a manic episode. And this has come up with, George before. I've made mention on several occasions that this particular character allows for a very broad discussion of topics in psychiatry. And bipolar 1 disorder is actually included. So for this condition, again, just to review what a manic episode is, an individual will have to demonstrate signs, usually pulled from an acronym that we learned, dig fast, that is at least 7 days, is demonstrative of a change from previous functioning and is clinically significant. That's the general idea. The hallmark quality, that is the single criterion that the individual must possess, is an elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. If the individual is experiencing an expansive or elevated mood, you need 4 criteria. If the individual is experiencing only an irritable mood due to its non-specificity, the American Psychiatric Association does require an additional symptom from the symptom set remembered by dig fast. So that's a general, very quick and rapid overview of mania. And certainly George appears that he might be demonstrating some of these signs. And as always with George, certainly interpersonal dysfunction is certainly pushing the narrative. So maybe mania. Generally speaking, maybe not so much with regard to the character of George Costanza in this particular episode, but generally speaking, through the lens of a psychiatrist, is there another condition that would be in our differential diagnosis that is hallmarked by an individual being so focused on one thing, it's to the detriment of other things that they maybe should be focusing on?
I was thinking an addiction.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So addiction. So that's when a drug, including alcohol, takes over one's life. Good. Yeah. That's certainly a metaphor for addiction medicine. Interestingly, I think there are 2 qualities here. I'm pulling from the episode that may be consistent with addiction. We could segue to Kramer's character and nicotine use disorder or tobacco use disorder. But I also think that Elaine's boyfriend might actually allow for a brief discussion in addiction medicine as well. So we'll get to Elaine and her boyfriend in just a little bit. But 2 easy segues there for what might be explaining George's behavior and perhaps that very topic also being demonstrated in not 1, but perhaps 2 characters in the episode, The Abstinence. The other thing I wanted to consider here was obsessive compulsive personality, where the individual becomes so task oriented, they actually lose perspective. And I think applicably, that could mean, in terms of interpersonal dysfunction or some other clinical significance, that they miss deadlines and perhaps endure work-related stress as a consequence. And I think this is necessary because of what develops in Elaine parallel to George. Again, remember, these two characters are always linked by the mere fact that they're never linked. The only reason why these two characters operate in the same world is because of Jerry Seinfeld, the character. Otherwise, Elaine Bennis and George Costanza would have never known each other, much less consider themselves friends. Yet in this episode, they are linked because of, I think, a condition called hoarding disorder. So again, number one, I don't see hoarding disorder as being represented in this episode per se, but I think there's a teaching point here. Number one is that George changes who he is a different person, quote unquote, as a result of that part of his brain, this is described by Jerry, being alleviated so that the drain can actually drain appropriately. And Elaine, on the other hand, has the opposite effect with regard to that, as I think her faucet is turned on. And when you think about it in those terms, they are metaphors for the two subtypes of hoarding disorder. Is it the problem of accumulation, or is it the problem of discarding? Is the faucet turned on too much, or is the drain plugged? And I think as metaphors, these two characters' behaviors, I think, are consistent with those two subtypes of hoarding disorder. Hoarding disorder, previous to 2013, was pretty much embedded in the condition of obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Because of its prevalence, the APA decided to pull it out from the OCD definition and give it its own diagnosis. And right now, hoarding disorder is in the chapter of obsessive compulsive and related disorders, that it is a disorder related to OCD. Okay? And this then allows us to talk about how OCD / hoarding disorder itself acts on a continuum with obsessive compulsive personality. That is that personality disorder hallmarked by the very trait that George demonstrates in this particular episode, that of being hyper-focused previous to the abstinence on something, sex, that results in his just losing interest or awareness of everything else, right? That's the task orientation and specificity that is a diagnostic criteria of OCPD. Any other thoughts about George or Elaine? And I will include Elaine's boyfriend in this too. I want to focus primarily on her helping her boyfriend study for what appears to be step 3. Right. So there is a question that is asked. We don't hear the question. We hear her boyfriend's answer as being metabolic acidosis. It's an acid-base disturbance. And she corrects him with the answer of hypokalemia. So just a quick review of conditions that can result in both metabolic acidosis and hypokalemia reveals a couple that the psychiatrist should know about. Any guesses? Because maybe if Larry David rewound just a little bit and included the actual question, it may have been a question in psychiatry. Well, there's two that I want you to know about. Certainly, the lithium effects can result in a metabolic acidosis with hypokalemia. So that could be a side effect of lithium, which itself then partners with or links to the identified mania in George Costanza in this episode. And the other one are the eating disorders that include binging and purging. So certainly anorexia nervosa, but bulimia nervosa as well. So bulimia, nervosa, eating disorders can result in both metabolic acidosis as well as hypokalemia. I'll go ahead and post the differential diagnosis on Instagram later today, but there's two conditions I wanted you to know about. The other one that comes up is rickets, can cause both. And I think at first glance, rickets would not be something that would be considered to be part of a psychiatrist's interest. However, that's not true. So that's a teaser. I'm not going to give it to you right now as to why rickets would be a focus in psychiatry. But I'll give you further hints and disclose the answer when we have our next session. All right, so that takes us through. Oh, yeah, the other thing I wanted to briefly mention before I leave this kind of triad, George Costanza, Elaine, and Elaine's boyfriend. I do see a couple of things with regard to her boyfriend beyond his studying for step 3. Number one is that as soon as he passes the test, he breaks up with Elaine. He idealizes her during the time they're going out and quickly devalues her. And while I think there's other components that are playing a role here, because biopsychosocial factors always play a role in not only predisposing to, but the precipitation of behavior, in this case, breakup behavior. The one thing I wanted to focus on is this idea of quickly shifting from idealization to devaluation, which we see in this character, and whether or not he has a condition of borderline personality disorder, right? Whether he's a splitter. The other thing as well, with regard to what might lead to such abrupt affect, right? Idealization, devaluation, in the differential with splitting and borderline personality is, of course, drug use. We always have to consider drugs, even when we look into maladaptive personality traits, as demonstrated in this character. And if he's studying the way he's studying, and he has the abrupt change in behavior that we see, that quick shift that we see, it may not be due to splitting. Maybe splitting is just a predisposing factor, but maybe the precipitant was his use of drugs, right? There are cognitive enhancers, stimulants, that students can abuse when studying for tests like step 3. So that's another consideration in our differential diagnosis, in as much as substance use disorder, and therefore a substance-induced mental disorder, must always be high in our differential diagnosis. All right, so that takes us through those characters. Any other observations? We're about halfway through here this morning. Any other observations with regard to the abstinence?
I think you briefly mentioned it earlier, but tobacco use disorder. I forget what the character's name is, but he was like excessively using tobacco products, and it caused like premature aging. So.
Yeah, you know, in Kramer, not only does he demonstrate tobacco use disorder, but in a larger context, Kramer always kind of pushes this notion of cross addiction. We know in previous as well as subsequent episodes that there are other behaviors that would fall in the addiction disorders chapter that Kramer demonstrates for us. And in this particular episode, it just so happens to be tobacco use disorder. What's interesting beyond that is that his lawsuit has everything to do with the way the product makes him look, and nothing to do with regard to the physiologic effects. First and foremost, because he doesn't demonstrate any, but even knowledge of those risk factors of heart disease and lung cancer are not part of the lawsuit. So in that way, I think Kramer's thinking is regressed. Certainly, probably, well, definitely before abstract operations with regard to the Piaget step theory. So he's regressed, and I'm not sure why, but it's reflected in the reason for his lawsuit. It's everything to do with physical appearance and nothing to do with the actual physiologic consequences of cigarette smoke or tobacco, or nicotine for that matter. Any other observations with Kramer?
I just wanted to add when he, just to add on to that point, when it was pointed out to him that his appearance was changing, he looked into the toaster and he listed off, yeah, I was thinking cancer, emphysema, this, but I never thought my appearance. So it seemed like he maybe very slightly acknowledged those things, but tossed them out and like hyper focused on that.
Any thought, any idea why a person like Kramer would be able to mention cancer emphysema and not have it guide their behavior? Especially from a psychiatric perspective. How could that be? He mentioned reasons why anyone would certainly reconsider, if not avoid, cigarette smoking. Why didn't it stop him? The reason actually is found in the principles that govern operant conditioning. Okay, well, what's operant conditioning? Operant conditioning is learning by consequences. Behaviors that are reinforced will strengthen. Behaviors that are punished will weaken. So Kramer smokes. He has something happen, hypothetically, that results in his no longer smoking. Whatever happened must have then been a punishment, because only punishment weakens behavior. Again, on the contrary, anything that reinforces will strengthen that behavior, such as cigarette smoking. Kramer has knowledge of emphysema and cancer. Why doesn't operant conditioning work here? The reason why is the temporal relationship between the punishment and the behavior. If emphysema is something that Kramer will actually be diagnosed with when he is 60, 20 years later, that is way too long an interval to allow the punishment to result in behavioral change. So one of the aspects of operant conditioning is the temporal relationship between the behavior and the reinforcer / punishment. The sequelae of cigarette smoking takes place decades later, because if it took place minutes after smoking, even adolescents would quit, but it doesn't. Right, so operant conditioning, and more specifically with regard to why it doesn't work in this particular episode, why it doesn't work in general when it comes to cigarette smoking, has everything to do with the time between the behavior and the punishment. What's classical conditioning? Now, I know some of you guys, after hearing me use the word operant this morning, had to have just searched classical conditioning, knowing that I would probably go there. Some of you who had that thought and may not be in front of a computer that would allow you to do it, probably are saying things behind your mask right now that I don't want to hear. Any guess? Classical conditioning.
Classical conditioning. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. You're good.
Classical conditioning is training of a trained response to an unfamiliar stimulus, like as if like Pavlov's dog, he has a natural response to food, which is salivating, but you trained it to him to have that same response to a bell by ringing a bell every time he sees food.
Exactly right.
That kind of stuff.
Good. Yep. Where operant conditioning is learning by consequences, classical conditioning is learning by association. Good job. That's exactly right. Well, that's your psychology, or at least learning theory 101 this morning. Any other thoughts about this particular episode of Seinfeld? Any other characters in the Abstinence that you want to discuss this morning?
There were certain elements of Kramer that seemed kind of histrionic, although I don't think he would totally fit that, but like his like emotions that were kind of about serious things were very like theatrical, about like thinking he could have had other illnesses and being like very excited about this billboard. And like, you know, that was more important than the lawsuit. I don't know.
Mhm. And, you know, and when we think of personality disorder, we have to think, among other things, about two major factors. Number one, is it pervasive? That is, at any one point in time, and I don't mean right here, right now specifically, but certainly with regard to the last several weeks to months, at any one point in time, is it pervasive? Does it cross social settings? And number two, is it stable over time? And for Kramer, with regard to your observation, with this very dramatic way he presents himself, it is very stable over time. For those of you who do watch the situational comedy, you know that every time, about 90+% of the time, he enters Jerry's apartment, it's very theatrical and it draws attention to himself. And if the motivation is because he needs to be the center of attention, this idea of interpreting your observation as a histrionic behavior, rule out histrionic personality disorder, is not off base. I mean, this is something that if it became clinically significant, would be very high in the differential diagnosis. Mhm. Remember, individuals with this condition need to be the center of attention. And the way they ensure that is either verbally or non-verbally. So individuals may opt to go nonverbal, and this certainly is largely influenced subconsciously, where dramatic entrances is a means of nonverbal communication to ensure that whoever is in the room they're entering will stop whatever they are doing and then focus on the individual who just entered, right? The grand entrance. Of course, they could do it verbally as well, or in any combination. Coming up to the bottom of the hour, any last minute observations or topics you'd like to talk about related to the abstinence? All right, we're going to leave it here then. For the clerks who are here, I'm in the office, so anytime you're ready, I will meet you in the conference room. For those who are following at home, be prepared. We will start the group text with regard to the gamification and meet you back here at 12:30, also on Periscope, for our Night's Watch discussion this afternoon on The Little Mermaid. See everybody back then.